So, hello and welcome back to Diving into the Public Domain, where our vote is in, all of everything has been tallied, and we're going to be reading Journey to the Center of the Earth by Jules Verne, who is honestly a fascinating author who I need to delve more into. I did not realize that he might have been more prolific than Stephen King at this point. Well, I'm not sure. I need to see how many novels Stephen King has written. But Jules Verne published an average of 2 novels a year. So it says in the little biography at the front of this that he 2 novels a year. He's got 54 books that were published during his lifetime, which is incredibly good. That's a lot of books. That's more books than I could ever write. Mostly because I don't like writing. I like reading. This book was published in 1864 and is considered one of the very first science fiction novels. I don't know if it's actually the first, but it influenced a lot of sci-fi in the future, and it's a really good kind of jumping off point to see how sci-fi developed. So I'm really interested to get into this. I think I might have read it back in junior high, but I don't remember. I know I read at least part of something by Jules Verne, but I don't remember anything about it. I also know that journeying to the center of the earth is not anything that's possible, but back in the 1800s, they didn't know that. In fact, back in the 1800s, they figured that was a completely logical thing. And they also thought that the moon had little men living on it. So we've kind of gone a long way. No chapter titles on these, and I'm not exactly sure how many chapters per night we're going to be reading. This is got a lot of chapters. They seem slightly on the short side in a lot of ways, and of course they're Roman numerals, so I'm going to have to go through and actually write them down. I can translate Roman numerals, but I'm not really the best at it because I'm not Roman or Latin or anything like that. I am just a dumb American. So I will probably go through and write down the chapter numbers so that I don't embarrass myself by saying the wrong number, because that's something that will happen if I don't. Anyway, we are going to be jumping today into at least chapter 1, maybe chapter 1 and 2. We'll see how long this goes. I'm aiming to keep these around the 30-minute mark, so we'll just have to see what we end up with. But we're going to be beginning chapter 1 of Journey to the Center of the Earth by Jules Verne. On May 24th, 1863, a Sunday, my uncle, Professor Lindenbrock, rushed back into his little house located at number 19 Konstraga, one of the most ancient streets of the old town of Hamburg. Martha the maid must have believed she was far behind schedule, for the dinner had only just begun to cook on the kitchen range. Well, I said to myself, if my uncle, the most impatient of men, is hungry, he will cry out in dismay. "Mr. Lindenbrock, so soon?" the good Martha exclaimed in amazement, half opening the dining room door. "Yes, Martha, but very likely the dinner is not half cooked, for it is not 2 yet. St. Michael's clock has only just struck 1:30. "Then why is Mr. Lindenbrock home so soon?" "He'll probably tell us himself." "Here he is. I'll stay out of the way. Mr. Axel, I won't get in your way while you argue with him." And the good Martha, retreated to her culinary laboratory. I was left alone, but arguing with the most irascible of professors was out of the question for someone of my somewhat undecided turn of mind. Just as I was cautiously retreating to my handsome room upstairs, the street door squeaked on its hinges. Large feet made the wooden staircase creak, and the master of the house rushed through the dining room immediately to his study. But during his swift passage, he had flung his hazel walking stick into a corner, his rough, broad-brimmed hat onto a table, and these emphatic words flung at his nephew: "Axel, follow me." I had scarcely had time to move when the professor already exclaimed in a tone of utter impatience, "Well, you aren't here yet?" And I rushed into my redoubtable master's study. Otto Lindenbrook had no mischief in him, I readily admit that, but unless he changes in unlikely ways, he is going to die a confirmed original. He was a professor at the Jonheim and taught a course on mineralogy, in the course of which he invariably broke into a rage once or twice each session. Not that he was at all concerned about having diligent students in his class, or about the degree of attention in which they listened to him, or the success they would eventually achieve. Such things never bothered him. His teaching was subjective, as German philosophy calls it. It was meant for himself, not others. He was a learned egoist, a well of science whose pulleys creaked when you wanted to draw anything out of it. In a word, he was a miser. There are quite a few professors of this sort in Germany. Unfortunately, my uncle was not gifted with great skill of delivery, if not in private, at least when he spoke in public, and this is a deplorable shortfall in a speaker. Indeed, during his lectures at the Jonheim, the professor often came to a complete standstill. He struggled with a reluctant word that did not want to pass his lips, one of those words that resist, expand, and finally slip out in the quite unscientific form of an oath. Hence his intense rage. Now, in mineralogy, there are many half-Greek and half-Latin terms that are hard to pronounce, rough words that would injure the lips of the poet. But I don't want to speak ill of this science, far from it. But when one faces rhombohedral crystals, retinospastic resins, gensites, fascites, monobolites, tungsteins of manganese, and tinzonite of zirconium, well, even the most skilled tongue may slip. Like mine probably did while trying to pronounce those. In the city, therefore, my uncle's forgivable weakness was well known, and it was exploited, and it was expected that the more dangerous moments, when he broke out in rage, and then there would be laughter, which is not in good taste, not even for Germans. And if there was always a full audience at the Lindenbrock lectures, well, how many came regularly to be entertained by the professor's wonderful fury? But nonetheless, my uncle, I must emphasize, was a genuine scholar. Even though he sometimes broke his specimens by handling them too roughly, he combined the geologist's genius with the mineralogist's keen eye. Armed with his hammer, his steel pointer, his magnetic needles, his blowpipe, and his bottle of nitric acid, he was a very powerful man. By assessing the fracture, the appearance, the hardness, the fusibility, the sonorousness, the smell, and the taste of any mineral, he was able to classify it unhesitatingly among the 600 substances known to science today. The name of Lindenbrock was therefore mentioned with respect in colleges and learned societies. Humphrey Dray, Humboldt, and both Captains Franklin and Sabine never failed to call on him on their way through Hamburg. Belcarl, Abelman, Brewster, Dumas, Mill Edwards, and St. Clair de Ville consulted him about the most difficult problems in chemistry. This discipline was indebted to him for quite remarkable discoveries, and in 1853 a treaty of transcendental crystallography by Professor Otto Lindenbrook had appeared in Leipzig, a large folio with illustrations which, however, did not cover its expenses. Add to all this that my uncle was curator of the Museum of Mineralogy established by Mr. Struve, the Russian ambassador, a valuable collection whose reputation is known throughout all of Europe. This, then, was the person who called me with such impatience. Imagine a tall, slender man of iron constitution and with a fair complexion which made him look a good 10 years younger than his 50. His large eyes moved incessantly behind his full-size spectacles. His long, thin nose looked like a knife blade. A mischievous tongue has even claimed that it was magnetic and it attracted iron filings. Sheer nonsense. It attracted nothing except snuff, but that, to be honest, it did attract in great quantities. When I add that my uncle walked in mathematical strides of half a fathom, and if I point out that in walking he kept his fists firmly clenched, a sure sign of the irritable temperament, it will be clear enough that his company was something less than desirable. He lived in his little house in Konstraga, a building made half of brick and half of wood with a steepled gable. It overlooked one of those winding canals that intersect in the middle of Hamburg's old town, which the Great Fire of 1842 had fortunately spared. The old house leaned a little, admittedly, and bulged out towards the streets. Its roof sloped a bit to one side, like the cap over the ear of a Tungenbald student. Its verticality left something to be desired, but overall it held up well, thanks to an old elm which buttressed it in front, and which in the spring pushed its flowering branches through the window panes. My uncle was reasonably well off for a German professor. The house was all its own, container and contents. The contents consisted of his goddaughter, Graben, a 17-year-old from Vinland, Martha, and myself. As his nephew and an orphan, I thus became his lab assistant. I admit, I plunged eagerly into the geological sciences. I had the blood of a mineralogist in my veins and never got bored in the company of my precious rocks. In a word, one could live happily in the little house on Kongstrasse, in spite of the impatience of its master, for even though he showed it in a somewhat rough fashion, he was nonetheless quite fond of me. But that man was unable to wait, and nature herself was often too slow for him. In April, after he had planted seedlings of mignonette and morning glory in the clay pots in his living room, he would go every morning and tug them by their leaves to accelerate their growth. Faced with such a character, one could do nothing other than obey, and so I, therefore, rushed after him into his study. And that is the end of chapter 1. So we're definitely going to read a second chapter, but I do have to say, I love the setting of this already. I mean, I get a very clear picture of a very irritable old professor who is nonetheless quite kind-hearted. So give me a second to grab a drink, unstick my tongue after a few words that were very interesting, and we will also read chapter 2. Journey to the Center of the Earth by Jules Verne, chapter 2. The study was a genuine museum. Specimens of everything known in mineralogy lay there labeled in the most perfect order according to the great divisions into inflammable, metallic, and lithoid minerals. How well I know all these bits of mineralogical science. How many times, instead of enjoying the company of boys my own age, had I enjoyed dusting these graphites, anthracites, coals, ligates, and peats, and the bitumens, resins, organic salts that needed to be protected from the least atom of dust, and these metals, from iron to gold, whose current value disappeared in the absolute equality of scientific specimens. And all these stones, enough to rebuild the house in the Kongstrasse, even with a handsome additional room, which would have suited me admirably. But on entering this study, I barely thought of all these wonders. My uncle alone filled my thoughts. He had thrown himself into an armchair covered with octret velvet and held in his hands a book that he contemplated with the profoundest admiration. "What a book! What a book!" he exclaimed. This exclamation reminded me that my uncle was also a bibliophile in his moments of leisure, but an old book had no value in his eyes unless it was very difficult to find or, at the very least, illegible. "Well," he said to me, "don't you see? Why, this is a priceless treasure that I found this morning browsing in Helvis in the man's shop." "Magnificent?" I said. Enthusiasm made to order. But actually, what was the point of all this fuss about an old quarto apparently bound in rough calfskin, a yellowish volume with a faded seal hanging from it? No matter. There was no end to the professor's admiring exclamations. "Look," he went on, both asking the questions and supplying the answers. "Isn't it a beauty? Yes, admirable. Did you ever see such a binding? Doesn't this book open easily? Yes, because it remains open anywhere. But does it shut equally well? Yes, because the binding and the leaves are flush, all in a straight line with no gaps or separations anywhere. And look at this spine. It doesn't show a single crack even after 700 years. Why, Bozerin, Kloss, or Puregold might have been proud of such a binding." As he spoke, my uncle kept opening and shutting the old tome. I really could do no less than ask a question about its contents, although they didn't interest me in the least. "And so what is the title of this marvelous work?" I asked, with an eagerness so pronounced that it had to be fake. "This work," said my uncle with renewed enthusiasm, "is the Haramis Kringla by Snorre Turleson, the famous Icelandic author of the 12th century. It is the chronicle of the Norwegian princes who ruled in Iceland." "Really?" I said with my best effort. "And of course it's a German translation." "What?" said the professor sharply. "A translation? And what would I do with a translation? Who cares about a translation? This is the original work in Icelandic, that magnificent language, rich and simple at the same time, which allows for infinite variety of grammatical combinations and multiple word modifications." "Like German," I skillfully remarked. "Yes," said my uncle, shrugging his shoulders. "But in addition, Icelandic has 3 genders like Greek, and delineations of nouns like Latin. Ah, I said, a bit shaken in my indifference. And is the typeface beautiful? Typeface? What do you mean by typeface, wretched Axel? Type, as if it were a matter of typeface. Ah, do you think this is a printed book? Ignorant fool, this is a manuscript, and a runic manuscript at that. Runic? Yes. Are you going to ask me now to explain the word to you? Of course not, I replied, in the tone of a man whose self-esteem has been wounded. But my uncle persevered anyway, and told me, quite against my will, about things that I did not care to know about. Runes, he told me, were characters once used in Iceland, and according to legend, they were invented by Odin himself. So look at this, impious young man, and admire the letters created by the imagination of a god. Well, not knowing what to say, I was going to prostrate myself before this wonderful book, a way of answering equally pleasing to gods and kings, because it has the advantage of never giving them any embarrassment, when a little incident happened to turn the conversation in another direction. It was the appearance of a dirty slip of parchment which slipped out of the volume and fell to the floor. My uncle pounced on this shred with quite understandable eagerness. An old document, hidden for time immemorial in an old book, inevitably had immeasurable value for my uncle. "What's this?" he exclaimed. And at the same time he carefully spread on the table a piece of parchment, 5 inches by 3, which was covered with horizontal lines of illegible characters. Here is the exact facsimile. It is important to me to let these bizarre signs be publicly known, for they incited Professor Lindenbrock and his nephew to undertake the strangest expedition in the entire 19th century. And there we go. Indecipherable signs. Ooh. And a illustration of Professor Lindenbach. Okay, he definitely fits the bill of mad scientist. I wonder what the ring he's wearing is. The professor mused for a few moments over this series of characters, and then he said, raising his spectacles, "These are runic letters. They are identical to those of Snorre Turleson's manuscript, but what could they possibly mean?" Since runic letters seemed to me an invention of the learned to mystify this poor world, I was not sorry to see that my uncle did not understand them. At least it seemed that way to me, judging from the movement of his fingers, which began to tremble violently. "But it's certainly Old Icelandic," he muttered between his teeth. And Professor Lindenbrock should know, for he was considered a genuine polyglot. Not that he could speak all 2,000 languages and 4,000 dialects that are spoken on the earth, but he did know his fair share of them. And so, faced with this difficulty, he was going to give way to all the impetuosity of his character, and I was anticipating a violent outbreak when 2 o'clock struck on the little timepiece over the fireplace. And immediately the housekeeper, Martha, opened the study door and said, "Dinner is ready." "To hell with dinner," shouted my uncle, "and the one who prepared it, and all those who will eat it." Martha fled. I followed her, and hardly knowing how I got there, I found myself seated at my usual place in the dining room. I waited a few minutes. The professor did not come. This was, to my knowledge, the first time he had ever missed the ritual of dinner. And what a dinner it was! Parsley soup, ham omelette garnished with spiced sorrel, filet of veal with a compote of prunes, and for dessert, sugared shrimp, and the whole of it washed down with a nice Moselle wine. All of this my uncle was going to sacrifice to a bit of old paper. Well, as a devoted nephew, I considered it my duty to eat for him as well as myself, and I did so conscientiously. "I've never seen such a thing," said Martha, the housekeeper. "Mr. Lindenbach not at table?" Who could believe it? "This means something serious is going to happen," said the old woman, shaking her head. In my opinion, it meant nothing more serious than an awful scene when my uncle discovered that his dinner had been eaten. I had come to my last shrimp when a stentorian voice tore me away from the pleasures of my dessert. With one leap, I bounded out of the dining room and into the study. And that is the end of chapter 2. And oh, I hope we get more food descriptions. I love food descriptions. Although a compote of prunes on top of veal and sugared shrimp is not exactly my idea of wonderful food. They ate weird things back in the day, didn't they? I mean, some of the stuff seems reasonable, but sugared shrimp? I wonder if sugared meant something different back then. I'm going to have to look that up. I recently thought about maybe trying to do some different recipes out of these old stories. I'm going to skip that one for now. I'm not a big fan of veal, but maybe we'll get some more descriptions of food, and maybe I can try and make them. That would be a lot of fun. Anyway, I'm really into this. This book is written very engagingly. And at first, I thought maybe our last book, Beverly of Graustark, was written in such engaging language because it was written in the early 1900s and by an American, but Jules Verne was very definitely a Frenchman and writing in the 1800s. So maybe it's just temperament of author. Maybe some authors just write very stuffy works, and other authors are like, no, man, we're going on a romp and a story. And I feel like this one is going to be a romp and a story. So be sure and come back tomorrow night when we are going to read another chapter or two of Journey to the Center of the Earth. Leave me a thumbs up if you don't mind. It does always make me smile. Subscribe if you haven't already, and I will see you tomorrow.